The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Sarah had always been a skeptic, rolling her eyes at ghost stories and urban legends. But when she inherited her grandmother's old farmhouse deep in the woods, things began to change. The house was massive, its wooden floors groaning under her footsteps. The first few nights were uneventful, but then came the noises, whispers in the walls, faint footsteps in the hallway, when she was the only one there. At first, she convinced herself it was her imagination, but the more she ignored it, the worse it got. One night, she woke up to a sound that made her blood run cold, scratching at her bedroom door. It wasn't hurried or frantic, just a slow, deliberate drag of nails across the wood. She sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything. Then, silence. Hours passed before she dared to open the door. Nothing was there. The following evening, she locked her bedroom door. That night, she woke again, but this time, not from a noise. It was the feeling of something watching her. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned her head. In the dim glow of the moonlight, she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of her room, barely visible, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a step forward, and in that moment, the bedroom door burst open. A gust of wind sent papers flying, and when she blinked, the figure was gone. The next day, she searched the entire house. That's when she found the attic door slightly ajar. She had never been up there before. With trembling hands, she pulled the cord for the attic light and climbed the steps. The smell of dust and decay filled her nose. Then she saw them, handprints, dozens of them, smeared on the walls as if something had been crawling there. And in the center of the attic was a single wooden chair. A sound came from behind her, a whisper close to her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. The chair creaked as if someone had just sat down. She turned and ran, slamming the attic door shut behind her. That night, she decided she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag and headed for the front door. But as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. The walls of the house were breathing, expanding and contracting like a living thing. The floor trembled beneath her feet. Then came the laughter, low, guttural, and wrong. It echoed from every corner of the house. She turned, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the figure. Its face was an empty void, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. Sarah ran. She didn't stop until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, throwing herself inside and locking the doors. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, its windows dark and soulless. She started the car, slammed her foot on the gas, and never looked back. But as she drove down the dark road, her headlights flickered. A chill ran down her spine. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and there in the back seat was the figure. It grinned. The car swerved, tires screeching against the pavement. And then, nothing. Just silence. Days later, when the police arrived at the farmhouse, they found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. But Sarah was gone. Inside the house, everything was as she left it, except for one thing. The attic door was wide open, and on the wooden chair sat a single blood-stained note. She never left.
Story number 2.
There was a small, quiet town nestled in the heart of the forest, where the people lived simple lives and didn't ask many questions. But there was one story they all whispered about, a story that everyone knew, but no one wanted to talk about. It was the story of the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, long left to rot, surrounded by dense trees. No one had dared to go near it in years, but the legend still haunted the town. It all began when a group of friends decided to spend a night exploring the old hospital. They were all thrill seekers, eager to test their courage. They arrived at sunset, the last traces of daylight casting an eerie glow over the crumbling building. The front door was wide open, as though inviting them inside. Despite the heavy air of dread that clung to the place, they entered. The hallways were dark, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the silence. They made their way through the building, the floor creaking beneath their weight. There were remnants of hospital equipment scattered around, and the walls were stained with dark patches that looked almost like blood. But the creepiest part was the strange, faint humming noise that seemed to come from nowhere. It grew louder the further they went, until it felt as if the very walls were alive with it. They reached the old operating room, the door hanging open. Inside, the smell of decay hit them like a wall. The room was filled with broken medical tools and yellowed sheets, but one thing stood out. On the far wall, written in what looked like fresh blood, were the words, "She never left." One of the friends, Mark, stepped forward to investigate. His flashlight flickered as he approached the wall, and when the light steadied, he saw something that made his heart freeze. There, in the corner, stood a figure just beyond the beam of the flashlight. A woman, her face pale and twisted, her eyes black as coal. She was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like you were already dead. Mark's voice caught in his throat as he tried to speak, but no sound came out. The others turned around just in time to see him back away slowly, his eyes wide with terror. The woman's smile stretched impossibly wide, and her mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. In a panic, the group rushed out of the room, but the hospital seemed to change around them. The walls twisted, the floorboards groaned under their feet, and the hallways grew longer, leading them in circles. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape. The humming noise grew louder until it was deafening. And then they heard it, the faintest whisper, but it felt as if it came from inside their skulls. "Run," it said. "Run while you still can." They didn't need to be told twice. They bolted for the exit, but as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in, and they began to pound on the door, shouting for help. But no one came. The air grew thick, and their breaths became shallow. Behind them, they could hear the woman's footsteps growing louder, closer, each step sending chills down their spines. And then the lights went out. The friends screamed, but the darkness was thick, swallowing them whole. It felt like an eternity before they were able to force the door open. They stumbled outside, gasping for breath, but when they looked back, the hospital was gone. There was no sign of it, just an empty patch of ground where it used to stand. But the terror didn't end there. That night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But when he turned his head to glance out the window, there she was, standing in his yard, staring up at him with that twisted smile. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the window, but when he looked again, she was gone. The next day, he told his friends, but they brushed it off, thinking it was just the lingering fear from the hospital. But as time passed, the strange occurrences grew worse. Mark saw her everywhere, in the reflection of a glass, in the shadows of his room, even in his dreams. And each time, she was closer. The last time anyone saw Mark, he was standing at the edge of the town, staring into the woods with a look of pure terror in his eyes. They called out to him, but he never responded. By the time they reached him, he was gone. The only thing left behind was a single bloodstained note clutched in his hand. It read, "She's coming for us all." And to this day, the town still whispers about the woman in the hospital and the friends who never made it out. Because once you see her, once you know she's real, you'll never truly be safe. She'll be waiting for you, and no one ever leaves.
Story number 3.
In a small village, isolated by miles of dense forest, there was a legend that the townsfolk never spoke of aloud. It was about the Whispering Woods, a stretch of trees that stood on the outskirts of the village. Every child knew the rule: never enter the woods after dark. But like most rules, it was often ignored by the curious, the brave, or the foolish. One night, a group of teenagers, eager for adventure, decided to prove their courage. They gathered their things, sneaking out of their homes and heading toward the woods. The night air was cold and still, and the moon barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees. The woods were silent, eerily so. The only sounds were their nervous laughter and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing taller and denser, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The further they walked, the darker it became, until they could no longer see more than a few feet ahead. One of the teens, Emma, pulled out her phone to use the flashlight. As she flicked it on, the beam swept over a patch of trees, and that's when they saw it. A shadow darted across their path, quick and strange, like a figure moving too fast for the human eye to catch. They stopped dead in their tracks, their hearts pounding. "Did you see that?" whispered one of them, but before anyone could answer, the whispering began. It was faint at first, a soft murmur in the distance. The voices were too far away to make out, but they seemed to come from all directions, rising and falling like a chorus. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. They turned, but there was nothing there. The murmurs grew into frantic voices, whispering in words they couldn't understand, but each word felt like a weight pressing on their minds. "Turn back," one voice said, clearer than the others. "Run," another hissed. Before they could react, Emma felt a hand brush against her shoulder. She whipped around, but no one was there. Panic set in. "We need to leave now," she shouted, but the others were frozen, their eyes wide with fear. The whispering voices grew louder, coming from the trees now, from the very earth beneath their feet. The branches above them twisted and creaked, as if something was moving through them. A figure materialized from the darkness, a tall, gaunt silhouette, its face hidden by a cloak of shadows. It stood motionless, staring at them with empty, hollow eyes. One by one, the teens turned to run, but it was as if the woods were against them. The path they had come down no longer seemed familiar. The trees had closed in, their branches now forming a maze, twisting and shifting around them. The whispers grew louder still, now right in their ears, urging them to keep running. But to where? Emma screamed as she felt something cold grip her ankle. She looked down and saw hands, blackened, with fingers too long, too twisted to be human, reaching out from the ground, pulling her down. She yanked her foot free, but the hands kept coming, dragging her toward the earth. Her friends tried to pull her up, but the force was too strong. The last thing she saw was the figure looming over her, its smile wide and inhuman. The next morning, the villagers found the group of teenagers' belongings scattered at the edge of the woods, their phones still ringing, but the kids themselves were never found. They searched for days, but the forest had swallowed them whole, as if they had never been there at all. Years passed, and the story faded into the background, but the whispering remained. Those who dared to walk near the woods at night claimed they could still hear the voices, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing year. One night, a man passing through the village stopped to ask about the whispering woods. The locals warned him, but he laughed, dismissing their fears. "It's just a bunch of old stories," he said. "I'll be fine." He entered the woods at dusk, determined to prove them wrong. At first, there was nothing. The forest was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves beneath his feet. But as the light dimmed, the whispers began. They were soft at first, like the wind, but they quickly grew louder, more insistent. He turned around, but the trees seemed to close in, blocking his path. The whispers now sounded like urgent pleas, voices begging him to leave. He tried to push through, but the air grew thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, like it was alive. And then, just as he thought he was about to escape, he felt a sharp pull on his leg. He looked down to see the ground opening up, revealing pale, twisted hands that shot up and grabbed him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the woods, but no one was there to hear them. The next morning, his car was found, abandoned at the edge of the forest. There were no signs of him anywhere. The villagers knew what had happened. They'd heard the whispers again. And to this day, the forest waits, its dark secrets hidden beneath the soil, whispering to anyone foolish enough to wander too close. The woods are alive, and they are always hungry.
Story number 4.
There was a small town hidden away in the valley, surrounded by tall, foreboding mountains. The people who lived there were mostly quiet and kept to themselves, but they all knew about the strange, chilling presence that haunted the nearby cave. The cave, called the Hollow Mouth by locals, was infamous for the disappearances that occurred over the years. It wasn't just the dark, oppressive atmosphere that made it terrifying. It was the feeling that someone was always waiting just inside. One day, a young man named Jack moved to the town. He'd heard the stories, of course, but like most outsiders, he brushed them off as superstition. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts or legends. He was there for work, a temporary stay before moving on, but he couldn't resist the pull of the cave. The locals warned him. They told him not to go near it. They said that once you entered, you might not come out. But Jack was stubborn. He had to see it for himself. So, one evening, with the setting sun casting long shadows over the town, he set out for the cave. The path to the cave was winding, cutting through dense woods, and the air grew colder as he ventured deeper into the trees. He could feel a strange pressure building around him, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. But Jack didn't turn back. He arrived at the cave just as twilight descended, its entrance wide and dark, say, like the open mouth of a giant. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The further he went, the more the air grew damp and heavy. His flashlight beam danced across the jagged walls, revealing strange markings carved into the stone. He could swear he heard faint whispers, just out of earshot, but when he stopped to listen, all was silent. He convinced himself it was his imagination, but then a voice, clear and cold, echoed through the cave. "Leave now." Jack froze. His heart thudded in his chest, his mind racing, but he was determined to see this through. He pressed forward, deeper into the cave, until the light from his flashlight flickered and went out. The darkness closed in, thick and suffocating. He reached for the spare batteries in his bag, but when his hand brushed against the flashlight again, something was different. The air felt heavier. It felt alive. He quickly replaced the batteries, but the light failed to turn on. Panic began to claw at him. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling him like a swarm of bees. His breath came in shallow gasps and his pulse pounded in his ears. He heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Jack spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there. The cave stretched endlessly in all directions. He started to back up, but then his foot struck something solid. He looked down and his stomach churned. He was standing on a pile of old bones, human bones. Before he could react, the whispers escalated into a cacophony of voices. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, choking the air with their cold, raspy words. "Leave," they hissed. "Leave or you'll stay forever." And then he saw it. In the darkness ahead, two glowing eyes appeared, hanging in the air unmoving. They seemed to be staring right through him. Jack couldn't move, couldn't scream, paralyzed by fear. The eyes grew larger, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall and thin, its face obscured by a cloak of darkness. The whispering voices swirled around him, growing louder and more frantic. "You're not meant to be here," the figure whispered, its voice cold as ice. Jack turned and ran, his breath ragged, his feet slipping on the uneven ground. The whispers followed him, now turning into laughter, low and cruel. The cave seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting, the path changing. He could no longer tell if he was going forward or backward. His mind raced, his body moving on autopilot, but the figure was still there, always just behind him, its steps too quiet, too sure. Finally, he saw the faint light of the cave entrance up ahead. He pushed himself harder, desperate to escape. But as he neared the exit, the ground beneath him cracked open. A dark hand reached out from the fissure, gripping his ankle, pulling him back into the blackness. He screamed, but no one would hear. The next morning, the townspeople found Jack's flashlight outside the cave, its beam still flickering weakly in the early light. But there was no sign of Jack. Weeks passed, and no one spoke of him again. But a strange thing happened. People began to hear the whispers. They'd be walking through the woods or sitting in their homes when the voices would start, quiet at first, just a faint murmur. Then they'd grow louder, more urgent. "Leave," they'd say. "Leave or you'll stay forever." And in the dead of night, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, could be heard, echoing through the trees. Jack never left the cave. And now, they say, he waits in the shadows, his voice joining the whispers, calling out to anyone foolish enough to venture too far into the hollow mountain.
Story number 5.
There was a small, quiet town on the outskirts of a desolate highway. It had all the features of a typical, sleepy rural place: rustic houses, a few scattered farms, and a deep sense of isolation. But there was one thing about this town that was different. It had no cemetery. The townspeople never talked about it. They never even acknowledged the strange fact that, despite having lived there for generations, there were no graves, no headstones, not even a single burial plot. Newcomers to the town would often ask where the cemetery was, and the older residents would simply offer vague, unsettling answers. "We don't need one," they'd say. It's best you don't ask. One autumn evening, a young man named Dave decided to find out for himself. He had just moved to the town for a fresh start, and the mystery of the cemetery intrigued him. He asked around, but no one would give him a straight answer. The more people avoided his questions, the more determined he became to uncover the truth. That night, after the town had fallen into a heavy silence, Dave set out on foot. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the dirt roads and the empty houses. He walked through the town's only main street, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he passed the rows of unkempt, weathered homes. There were no lights on in the windows, no sounds of life coming from inside. He made his way to the edge of town, where he had heard a rumor that the missing cemetery could be found. The woods beyond the town were thick, dark, and quiet. It felt like they were pressing in on him with every step. As he ventured deeper into the trees, the air grew colder, the wind carrying an unsettling chill. Then he saw it. A clearing appeared in the woods, bathed in the pale light of the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a single, massive tree, its gnarled branches stretching high into the night sky. Beneath the tree, something caught his eye, what appeared to be a stone slab, half buried in the ground. Dave approached cautiously. As he got closer, he noticed the ground around the tree was uneven, as though something had been buried beneath it. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he knelt down beside the slab, brushing away the dirt. He was horrified by what he uncovered, a name carved into the stone, but the letters were old and faded, barely legible. As he strained to read it, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. The name read, The Forgotten. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, low, hollow, and cold. "Why are you here?" Dave spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing behind him, silhouetted by the tree's twisted branches, was a figure. Its face was obscured, its body thin and tattered, as though it had been dragged from the depths of the earth. It was standing perfectly still, its hands hanging limp at its sides. "Who are you?" Dave asked, his voice trembling. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. "We are the Forgotten," it whispered. "You should not have come." Before Dave could respond, the ground around the tree began to tremble, and from the earth, figures began to rise, one after another. They were pale, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty and hollow. They had no skin, only bone and muscle, their bodies wrapped in tattered remnants of clothes from different eras. They reached out toward Dave with skeletal hands, their mouths open in silent screams as if begging for release. Dave stumbled back, but the figures continued to rise, surrounding him. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers grew louder. "You are one of us now," they said, their voices a chorus of despair. Desperate, Dave turned and ran, but the figures were faster. They closed in on him, their hands grabbing at his clothes, his arms pulling him back. He could feel their cold fingers digging into his skin, and the air around him seemed to darken, swallowing him whole. With one final surge of strength, Dave broke free and sprinted back toward the town, the sounds of the figure's hollow footsteps echoing behind him. He didn't stop until he reached his house, slamming the door behind him. His heart raced, his breath shallow, but the whispers still echoed in his ears, growing louder, louder. For weeks, Dave didn't sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him. He could hear the whispers, even when he was inside his house, that's safe behind locked doors. It wasn't long before he began seeing figures in his peripheral vision, pale, emaciated shapes standing just out of sight, waiting for him to look directly at them. One night, he decided to leave the town for good. He packed a bag, grabbed his car keys, and made for the door. But when he stepped outside, he froze. The town was different. The streets were empty, the houses dark. No one was outside. As he walked to his car, he noticed something strange. The trees, the buildings, everything around him, everything was just like the clearing in the woods. The figures were there, standing at the edge of his vision, reaching out, but this time they didn't whisper. They just stared. Dave was never seen again. The next morning, the people of the town went about their usual business. No one spoke of Dave's disappearance. No one even acknowledged his absence. The town continued to exist, as it always had. But if you were to wander into the woods on a moonless night, you might still hear the whispers, still see the pale figures waiting, their faces twisted in eternal hunger. They're waiting for someone else to make the same mistake Dave did, someone else to enter the town. And when that person does, the figures will rise again, and the cycle will continue. The town's secret will never be revealed, and no one will ever leave.
Story number 6.
In a small, isolated village at the edge of a vast, dense forest, there was a chilling tale that had been passed down for generations. The villagers would warn outsiders, saying, "Stay away from the well." But as with most warnings, the words were ignored by those who weren't from the village. One evening, a curious young man named Thomas arrived in the village. He had heard the rumors about the well, how it was cursed, how it had claimed the lives of several villagers over the years. But he didn't believe in such things. To him, it was all superstition. The well was an old relic of the past, and it was the perfect thing for him to investigate. The villagers tried to warn him, but he shrugged them off, laughing at their stories. "Old legends," he muttered, rolling his eyes. "You people should move on." It was well into the night when Thomas ventured out to find the well. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy of trees as he made his way through the dense forest, the ground soft and spongy beneath his boots. His flashlight flickered ominously, casting long, wavering shadows on the path. The air was heavy, and an eerie silence hung over the woods, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he found it. The well stood alone in a small clearing, its stone walls covered in moss and thick vines, its mouth dark and foreboding. It looked ancient, a relic from some forgotten time. Thomas approached the well, his flashlight sweeping across the area. The wind began to pick up, and with it a strange feeling of unease crept up his spine. He peered over the edge, shining the light down into the black void. There was no water at the bottom, only darkness, an endless, consuming darkness. He felt a shiver run through him, but he laughed it off. "It's just an old well," he muttered to himself. "No need to be afraid." But as he turned to leave, he heard it, a faint whisper, soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder. "Thomas?" He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was like a low, rasping hiss, but it wasn't coming from any direction he could see. It came from the well itself. "Thomas," the voice repeated, now louder and more urgent. He could hear the sound of something scraping against the stone inside the well, like claws dragging across the rough surface. His heart raced as he took a step back, but the voice didn't stop. It called his name over and over, more frantic now, more pleading. "Help me." The whisper had changed, no longer just a voice, but a voice full of desperation, of pain. Thomas found himself drawn to the edge of the well again, his mind spinning, his body moving against his will. He leaned over, staring into the darkness below, and that's when he saw it. A face, a pale, disfigured face, its eyes wide and empty, staring up at him from the depths of the well. The face was covered in muck, its skin stretched tight over bone. Its mouth opened wide, and the whisper came again, this time louder, almost screaming. "Help me, please!" Thomas stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice wasn't coming from the well anymore. It was coming from all around him, a chorus of screams, of voices begging for release. Without thinking, he turned and fled into the woods, the sounds of pleading and wailing following him, echoing in his ears. The trees seemed to move as he ran, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was chasing him, something just out of sight. Finally, he broke through the trees and into the village. He collapsed at the doorstep of the nearest house, gasping for air. The villagers rushed to him, asking what happened, but all he could do was stare wide-eyed at them, his hands shaking. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the voices, the pleading calls for help, ringing in his ears, no matter how tightly he shut his eyes. The next morning, he was gone. There was no sign of him, not a trace. The villagers searched for days, but it was as if he had vanished completely, swallowed by the earth itself. Weeks passed and the legend of the well remained, but now there was something more to the tale. The villagers spoke of a new voice that could sometimes be heard late at night, one that sounded eerily like Thomas. It would whisper the same words over and over, "Help me." And those brave enough to venture near the well, as Thomas had done, began to report strange occurrences. They would hear their names whispered on the wind, see shadows moving just out of the corner of their eyes, or feel something cold and clammy brush against their skin. They would come back with the same hollow, terrified look in their eyes, but never speak a word of what they had seen. The well had claimed another soul, and no one ever ventured near it again. But still, every night the whispers could be heard, soft at first, but growing louder and more frantic. Help me, they pleaded, echoing through the forest. Some say the well still calls for someone to release it, to release the dark thing trapped within. But those who have tried never return, swallowed by the curse that lies beneath the surface, lost forever in the endless dark. And so the villagers live in fear, knowing that one day someone else will hear that whisper, and when they do, there will be no escaping it, because the well never lets go.
Story number 7.
There was a remote, rundown motel tucked away on a lonely stretch of highway, far from any town or city. The kind of place travelers would stop at when they had no choice, the kind of place you'd find yourself in when you had nowhere else to go. It was run by an older couple, quiet people who had been living there for as long as anyone could remember. The walls of the motel were stained with age, and the flickering neon sign outside cast an unsettling glow on the cracked pavement. The rooms were small, dusty, and musty, but they served their purpose. One night, a weary traveler named Jake found himself pulling into the motel parking lot. He had been driving for hours, and the signs of fatigue were evident in his bloodshot eyes. He could see the worn-out sign and the dark, empty parking lot in the distance. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was the only place for miles. His headlights cut through the darkness as he parked and made his way toward the front desk. The door to the office creaked open, and inside, the couple was seated at a small desk. The old man, gray-haired and hunched over, looked up at Jake with a faint smile. His wife, a frail woman with a distant stare, sat quietly in the corner, her eyes never leaving him. "Checking in?" the old man rasped, his voice soft but unnerving. "We don't get many visitors this late. I'll give you the best room we have." Jake nodded, too tired to argue. He was eager to get some rest. The man handed him a key to room 7, and with a muttered thanks, Jake made his way down the narrow hallway to the room. The room was just as expected, dingy, outdated, with faded wallpaper and a flickering light above the bed. The air smelled musty, and there was an eerie silence that seemed to hang heavy in the room. Jake tossed his bag onto the bed and lay down, the exhaustion of the long drive quickly taking over. As he began to drift off to sleep, a strange sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, like a faint tapping. He thought it might be the wind or perhaps a rat, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the corner of the room where the shadows pooled. Jake sat up, his heart racing. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, until it turned into scratching, sharp, uneven scratches against the wall. He stood up slowly, his legs weak from sleep, and moved toward the noise. He reached the corner, his breath shallow, and hesitated before pulling back the thin curtain that covered the small window. What he saw made his stomach drop. Outside in the darkness, there was something, or someone, crawling along the side of the motel. A figure, hunched over, dragging itself along the ground with grotesque, jerking movements. The moonlight caught a glimpse of its pale, gaunt face, twisted in agony, its eyes wide and vacant. It was crawling toward the window, scraping its fingers against the stone wall as it got closer. Jake's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair in his panic, but the thing outside didn't stop. It continued its slow, unnatural crawl toward him, its fingers scraping louder now, reverberating through the room. With a final heart-stopping scream, Jake slammed the window shut. But it wasn't over. The sound of scraping didn't stop. Instead, it moved to the walls of the room, the ceiling, the floor. It was as if the thing was inside the very motel itself, creeping through the walls. Jake could hear it scratching its way toward him, relentless. He bolted for the door, but it was locked. He tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he slammed against the door with all his strength. The room began to feel smaller, the walls pressing in around him. The scratches grew louder, closer, until they were right behind him. The door finally flew open with a loud bang. Jake darted out into the hallway, But the moment he stepped out of the room, he saw something that froze him in place. The old man and his wife were standing there, blocking his way, their expressions eerily calm. The wife was staring at him with empty eyes, her face pale and lifeless. The man stepped forward, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "We warned you," the man said softly. "The room is not for you." Before Jake could react, a cold, bony hand grabbed his shoulder. He spun around to find the crawling figure behind him, its pale face twisted into a grin of pure malice. Its fingers dug into his skin, cold and clammy, as it dragged him back toward the room. The last thing Jake saw before everything went black was the old couple's smiling faces as they stood motionless in the hallway. Then, the crawling figure pulled him into the darkness. The next morning, the old couple found the room in perfect condition. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of the man who had checked in the night before. The bed was made, and the room was silent. But the scratching, it never stopped. The sound was still there, faint at first, but always lingering, echoing through the walls. And the couple, now looking a little older, continued their routine, waiting for the next traveler to arrive. Because in that place, there was always room for one more. The motel was a trap, and those who checked in never left.
Story number 8.
In a remote area far from civilization stood an old, abandoned house. The villagers had always whispered about it, cautioning anyone who came too close. They said it was cursed, that those who entered never came back the same, if they ever came back at all. The house was decaying, its windows boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, as though it were waiting for something, or someone, to come in. One rainy evening, a man named Ethan arrived in the village. He was a skeptic, always brushing off local legends and superstitions as nothing more than stories. When he heard the whispers about the old house, he found himself intrigued. He was alone, far from his usual surroundings, and he had nothing better to do. So, despite the warnings from the villagers, he decided to explore the house. The rain had been falling heavily, and the wet earth made his steps heavy as he walked toward the house. The overgrown vegetation and twisted branches seemed to claw at him as he moved closer. The house was even more foreboding up close, with its cracked walls and sagging roof. There was no sound except for the rain, and even the forest around it seemed unnervingly quiet. Ethan stood at the door, hesitating for only a moment. He pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, like a scream that had been waiting for years to escape. Inside, the air was thick and stale, and the floor creaked under his weight. The darkness inside was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He walked deeper into the house, his flashlight illuminating the faded, peeling wallpaper and the remnants of old furniture that seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. It felt as though time had stopped inside the house, and yet something about the stillness felt alive. Ethan's curiosity pushed him further, despite the overwhelming sense of unease crawling up his spine. He reached the staircase, its steps warped and broken, leading to the upper floor. As he ascended, the sound of his footsteps was oddly muffled, as though the house was trying to absorb his presence. On the second floor, he found a long, narrow hallway. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar, with a faint flickering light coming from inside. The door seemed to beckon him. He approached cautiously and slowly pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, and in the center of it stood a large, antique mirror. Its surface was covered in grime, but Ethan could still make out his reflection. However, as he stared into the glass, something felt off. His reflection didn't quite match his movements. His image in the mirror was slower, almost as if it were watching him rather than the other way around. Suddenly, the reflection smiled. Ethan staggered back in shock, his heart pounding. He spun around, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was still smiling, grinning, a twisted, grotesque smile that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of human expression. The air in the room grew colder, and the light began to flicker more violently. Then the whispering began. At first, it was soft, like a murmur from far away. But then the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though something was trying to speak through the mirror. The words were unintelligible at first, just a cacophony of hushed voices, but slowly they began to form words. "Join us," they whispered. "Become one of us." Ethan's pulse quickened. He tried to back away, but his legs felt heavy, like the floor beneath him was pulling him closer to the mirror. The reflection in the glass began to change. It was no longer just Ethan. There were figures moving behind him, shadows, stretching and contorting in unnatural ways, their faces twisted with malevolent glee. He could hear the soft, shuffling steps of something approaching him from behind, but when he turned around, the room was still empty. "Join us!" The whisper came again, closer now, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Before he could react, a cold, skeletal hand shot out from the mirror, gripping his arm with inhuman strength. Ethan screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand tightened, its fingers digging into his flesh like claws. The glass of the mirror rippled, distorting, as if something was trying to break through. Panic surged through Ethan as he struggled to free himself, but the hand dragged him closer to the mirror, and the shadows in the reflection began to reach for him. It was as though the mirror had become a gateway, pulling him into the darkness beyond. With a final desperate cry, he managed to tear his arm free, but he was not the same. He stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror, as he backed into the corner of the room. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows began to spill out of the mirror, swirling around him, crawling up his body. Ethan tried to run, but as he turned toward the door, the reflection in the mirror didn't move with him. Instead, the figure in the mirror remained behind, watching him with an unblinking gaze. He ran down the stairs, his breath ragged, but every corner of the house seemed to twist and change. The walls closed in around him, the floorboards creaked beneath him, and all he could hear was the laughter, soft at first, then louder and more sinister, like a chorus of mocking voices. As he reached the front door, it slammed shut in front of him, trapping him inside. The house was no longer silent. The walls were alive with whispers, and the dark figures from the mirror began to crawl out of the cracks in the walls, reaching for him. He was never seen again. Days later, the villagers ventured into the house, hoping to find Ethan. But when they reached the room with the mirror, they found nothing but the reflection of the room, empty, just as it had always been. No sign of Ethan, no trace of his struggle. But if you stand in front of that mirror at night, you might see something, a faint movement behind you, a shadow that doesn't quite belong. And if you look closely, you'll see someone else standing there with you, staring back at you with a twisted grin. And they will never leave, because the house does not let anyone go, not once they've been claimed.